The largest city on Earth in the 12th century was not in Europe. It was hidden deep in the lowland plains of Southeast Asia. While London held barely a few tens of thousands of people, the great city of Angkor supported a population approaching 1 million, kept alive by one of the most sophisticated water engineering networks the ancient world ever built. So how does an empire capable of managing a water system on this staggering scale, and capable of constructing stone temples larger than the pyramids of Egypt, end up brought down by the very engineering that had made it great in the first place? Why was this once mighty center of power ultimately abandoned to the silent embrace of the jungle? This is the true, documented story of engineering ambition, religious transformation, and environmental catastrophe that shaped the rise and fall of the Khmer Empire, the empire that built Angkor. The scale of what was eventually lost and then rediscovered still astonishes researchers studying the site today. At its height, Greater Angkor covered an urban footprint now understood, thanks to modern remote sensing technology, to have sprawled across more than 1,000 square kilometers, making it, by physical extent, one of the largest pre-industrial urban settlements ever constructed anywhere on the planet. The civilization that built this sprawling metropolis had no access to iron tools comparable to contemporary Europe, no wheeled irrigation technology, and no mechanical pumps of any kind, yet it managed water on a scale that modern engineers continue to study with genuine professional admiration. Understanding how such a sophisticated civilization eventually came apart requires looking well beyond any single invading army, into a slow-motion environmental and administrative crisis that unfolded across generations, quietly undermining the very engineering marvel that had made Angkor's greatness possible in the first place. There is a particular irony embedded in this story that becomes clearer the more closely historians examine the archaeological and climatological evidence. The same water management system that allowed Angkor to feed and sustain a population unmatched anywhere else on the planet also created a form of infrastructural dependency that few other pre-modern civilizations ever developed to quite the same degree. A drought-stricken farming village in medieval Europe could, however painfully, fall back on more traditional rain-fed agricultural methods when engineered systems failed. Angkor's population, having grown so large specifically because of what the hydraulic system made possible, had far less room to fall back on simpler alternatives once that same system began failing, meaning the very success of Khmer engineering had, over centuries, quietly increased the scale of catastrophe that any eventual infrastructure failure would produce. Before 802 AD, the territory that is now Cambodia was divided among a patchwork of smaller competing kingdoms, generally grouped by later historians into what Chinese sources called water chenla and land chenla, both frequently subject to raids and political pressure from the powerful maritime kingdoms of Java to the south. Everything changed with the emergence of a prince named Jayavarman II, who returned from a period of residence in Java and began a sustained military and political campaign to unify these scattered petty kingdoms into a single coherent state. In 802 AD, atop the sacred Kulan mountain plateau north of what would become Angkor, Jayavarman II conducted an elaborate Brahmanical religious ceremony, formally declaring independence from Javanese overlordship and establishing himself as a Devaraja, a god-king, believed to embody the divine authority of the Hindu god Shiva made manifest on earth. This declaration of divine kingship was not simply symbolic theatre. It granted the Khmer monarch what amounted to absolute practical authority to command enormous quantities of labour from his subjects, a power that would prove decisive in everything the empire subsequently built, since virtually every major construction project across the following 6 centuries depended on the state's ability to mobilize hundreds of thousands of workers on command. The capital itself moved between several locations in these early decades, before finally settling at Hariharalaya, in the region known today as Roluos, establishing the essential foundation from which the much larger and more famous Angkor complex would eventually grow. The specific religious ceremony Jayavarman II conducted atop Kulen Mountain deserves particular attention, since it established a political and theological framework that would govern Khmer statecraft for the following 6 centuries. The Brahmin priest who officiated the ritual, according to inscriptions later carved into temple stelae, declared that this land would never again be subject to Java, effectively transforming a political declaration of independence into a matter of sacred, unbreakable religious obligation. This fusion of political sovereignty with divine sanction gave Jayavarman II's successors a powerful ideological tool. Any challenge to the reigning king's authority could be framed not merely as political rebellion, but as blasphemy against the cosmic order itself, a rhetorical and religious weapon that Khmer rulers would continue wielding, with varying degrees of success, throughout the empire's subsequent history. The historical sources documenting these early Khmer kings present genuine interpretive challenges that scholars continue working through today. Unlike the relatively abundant later inscriptions from Angkor's peak centuries, evidence for Jayavarman II's specific reign comes primarily from a single, much later inscription, the K.235 stele at Stok Kok Tom, dated to 1052, more than 2 centuries after the events it describes. This significant temporal gap between the events described and their documentary record means historians must treat many specific details of the traditional founding narrative with appropriate scholarly caution, even while the broader outline of Khmer unification and the establishment of Devaraja ideology during this general period remains well supported by the accumulated archaeological and epigraphic evidence from the sites themselves. King Indravarman I, who came to power in the late 9th century, pioneered the specific engineering approach that would come to define the entire Khmer civilization, the construction of massive artificial reservoirs called barre, beginning with the Indratataka reservoir near the old capital. The underlying strategic principle was simple and absolute. Whoever controlled water controlled life itself in this agricultural society. Reliable water storage meant farmers could conduct rice cultivation even through the punishing dry season, ensuring a food surplus reliable enough to support a population far larger than rain-fed agriculture alone could ever sustain. King Yasovarman I subsequently relocated the capital to the area now known as Angkor, constructing a new city called Yasodharapura, centered around the sacred hill of Phnom Bakheng. His signature engineering achievement was the East Barre, an artificial reservoir measuring roughly 7 kilometers in length and 2 kilometers in width, excavated entirely through human labor without any mechanical assistance whatsoever. This period also saw the establishment of the administrative apparatus that would fund all subsequent construction, a systematic tax structure collecting rice and mandatory labor service, known as corvée, which provided the sustained resource base necessary for the increasingly ambitious building projects that successive kings would undertake across the following centuries. Indravarman I's approach to legitimizing his own rule through visible construction achievement established a template that nearly every subsequent Khmer king would follow with remarkable consistency. Rather than relying solely on military conquest or inherited bloodline to justify his authority, he understood that a ruler who could demonstrably provide water security, and therefore food security, for his subjects earned a form of practical political legitimacy that pure military force could never fully replicate. This specific insight, that hydraulic engineering was simultaneously an economic necessity and a powerful political statement, became deeply embedded in Khmer royal ideology, meaning that every subsequent Khmer king faced enormous cultural pressure to expand or improve the water system he inherited, a pressure that would eventually contribute to the system growing so large and so complex that maintaining it properly became genuinely difficult even for a well-organized and well-resourced state. The scale of labor mobilization required for these early reservoir projects also deserves consideration as an indicator of the administrative sophistication the Khmer state had already developed by this relatively early period. The Indra-Tataka reservoir, while considerably smaller than the later barai constructed at Angkor itself, still required coordinated excavation across an area of several square kilometers, accomplished entirely through manual labor using simple tools including wooden shovels, baskets for hauling excavated earth, and coordinated teams working according to a planned excavation sequence. Inscriptions from this period reference the specific administrative titles and responsibilities of officials tasked with organizing this labor, indicating that a genuinely sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus for managing large-scale public works projects had already developed well before the more famous later reservoirs at Angkor were even conceived. Angkor's water management system operated on pure gravity rather than any mechanical pumping technology, channeling water downhill from the Kulin mountain range into an elaborate network of canals, moats, and reservoirs that together formed one of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering achievements anywhere in the pre-modern world. Under King Suryavarman I, the empire constructed the West Barai, the largest reservoir ever built at Angkor, measuring approximately 8 kilometers by 2.2 kilometers and capable of holding an estimated 53 million cubic meters of water. A vast network of interconnected canals, stretching hundreds of kilometers in total length, distributed this stored water to hundreds of thousands of hectares of rice paddies, while simultaneously providing flood control during the intense seasonal monsoon rains. Sophisticated spillway technology allowed engineers to release excess water during the wet season while carefully conserving supplies through the dry months, a level of hydraulic control that required constant maintenance and precise engineering calculation to function correctly year after year. The direct consequence of this system was extraordinary agricultural productivity. While most of the contemporary world depended entirely on seasonal rainfall for a single annual harvest, Angkor's engineered water supply allowed farmers to potentially harvest rice 3 to 4 times per year in some areas, supporting a population that many modern historians estimate reached as high as 1 million people at the city's peak, an urban concentration of human beings that had no equal anywhere else on Earth at that specific moment in history. The sheer physical scale of this hydraulic achievement becomes clearer when compared against contemporary engineering projects elsewhere in the medieval world. The West Barai alone, at 53 million cubic meters of storage capacity, dwarfed any comparable water storage project undertaken in medieval Europe, where similar reservoir engineering on this scale would not be attempted again until the Industrial Revolution centuries later. French archaeologist Bernard-Philippe Groslier, who conducted extensive aerial photographic surveys of the Angkor region in the mid-20th century, was among the first Western researchers to argue systematically that Angkor should be understood primarily as a hydraulic city, one whose entire urban form and political organization had been fundamentally shaped by the demands of water management on a scale that few other pre-industrial civilizations anywhere in the world ever attempted to replicate. The specific technical challenge of maintaining a gravity-fed water system across such enormous distances deserves further examination, since it explains much about both the system's initial success and its eventual vulnerability. Unlike mechanically pumped systems that can be adjusted relatively easily by controlling pump output, gravity-fed hydraulic networks require extremely precise initial engineering calculations regarding elevation, channel gradient, and reservoir capacity, since water will only flow in the specific directions and at the specific rates that the underlying topography and channel design actually permit. Any subsequent silting, structural damage, or unauthorized modification to this carefully calibrated system, whether from natural sediment accumulation, earthquake damage, or even well-intentioned local farmers diverting water for their own immediate agricultural needs, could disrupt water flow patterns throughout the entire connected network in ways that were often difficult to fully diagnose and correct without comprehensive engineering surveys that later, less centrally organized Khmer administrations increasingly lacked the resources and expertise to conduct. Suryavarman II seized the Khmer throne in 1113 through a violent conflict with a rival claimant, reportedly killing his predecessor personally during single combat atop war elephants in the midst of battle. His reign launched an era of rapid and aggressive military expansion, with Khmer armies extending the empire's influence eastward against the Kingdom of Champa, northward against Vietnamese territories, and westward into what is now central Thailand. Suryavarman II also cultivated formal diplomatic relations with China's Song dynasty, dispatching royal embassies specifically intended to strengthen both commercial trade relationships and broader international political recognition and legitimacy for his rule. Both contemporary Chinese written records and surviving Khmer stone carvings document formidable war elephant corps numbering in the thousands, which functioned as the empire's most feared and most visually dominant military asset on the battlefield. In a significant religious shift, Suryavarman II elevated the Hindu god Vishnu above Shiva as the empire's primary state deity, setting the specific ideological and religious foundation for what would become the single most ambitious construction project in the entire history of the Khmer Empire. The circumstances surrounding Suryavarman II's violent ascension to the throne, described in temple inscriptions with a directness unusual for royal commemorative texts of this era, reveal something important about the genuinely precarious nature of Khmer succession politics, even at the height of the empire's power and prosperity. Unlike the more gradual negotiated successions that characterized some other contemporary monarchies, Khmer royal succession frequently depended on demonstrated military capability and the ability to physically eliminate rival claimants, a system that rewarded exactly the kind of decisive, ruthless leadership that allowed Suryavarman II to subsequently launch such an ambitious program of both military conquest and monumental construction, but that also meant the empire's stability remained perpetually vulnerable to exactly the kind of succession crisis that would eventually help open the door to the catastrophic Cham invasion following his death. Angkor Wat, constructed under Suryavarman II's direct patronage, used more total stone in its construction than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, making it by sheer volume of material one of the largest religious monuments ever constructed anywhere in the world. The sandstone blocks used in construction, some weighing several tons each, were transported via an elaborate network of canals and man-made channels from quarries at the base of the Kulin mountain range, located nearly 40 kilometers from the temple construction site itself. The entire temple complex was deliberately built on a foundation of sand, specifically chosen for its engineering properties, surrounded by a massive moat whose hydraulic pressure paradoxically helped stabilize the temple's foundation against subsidence and settling over time, rather than threatening it. Remarkably precise astronomical calculations were incorporated directly into the temple's architectural orientation, with the entire structure aligned so that during the spring equinox sunrise, the sun appears to rise directly above the temple's central tower when viewed from the main entrance causeway. Angkor Wat served multiple simultaneous functions beyond simple religious worship. It was conceived and constructed as temple, as royal mausoleum, and as an enduring physical symbol of the king's eternal, unshakable divine authority, a monument intended quite literally to outlast the mortal reign of the specific ruler who commissioned it. Modern engineering analysis of Angkor Wat's construction has revealed a level of hydraulic sophistication in the temple's own foundation design that complements the broader water management achievements of the empire as a whole. Researchers studying the temple's structural stability have determined that the surrounding moat was not simply decorative or defensive in function, but served a genuinely essential engineering purpose, maintaining consistent groundwater saturation beneath the sand foundation, preventing the kind of differential settling that would otherwise threaten a structure of this immense weight and scale over time. This means that the very water management expertise the Khmer Empire had spent generations developing for agricultural purposes was directly repurposed to solve one of the most difficult structural engineering challenges involved in constructing the largest religious monument the medieval world had yet produced. A genuinely elegant technical solution that modern structural engineers studying the site continue to find impressive nearly 9 centuries after its original construction. The labor mobilization required to complete Angkor Wat within roughly 3 decades represents another aspect of the project's genuine engineering achievement, one frequently overlooked in favor of discussions about the temple's artistic and religious symbolism. Historians estimate that construction likely required the sustained labor of tens of thousands of workers simultaneously, including stonemasons, sculptors specializing in the temple's extensive bas-relief carvings, depicting scenes from Hindu mythology and Suryavarman II's own military campaigns, laborers responsible for quarrying and transporting stone, and the administrators required to coordinate food supply, housing, and work schedules for this enormous temporary workforce. The nearly 40-kilometer transportation route from the Kulen mountain quarries to the construction site itself represents a substantial logistical achievement independent of the temple's architecture, requiring careful coordination of canal maintenance, barge scheduling, and overland transport for the final stages of the journey to ensure a continuous supply of stone throughout the decades-long construction process. Following Suryavarman II's death, central royal authority began to weaken considerably as the empire fell into a period of internal succession disputes and factional political instability among competing claimants to the throne. In 1177, forces from the neighboring kingdom of Champa executed a devastatingly effective surprise attack, sailing their war fleet up the Mekong River and across the Tonle Sap Lake directly toward the very heart of the Khmer capital itself. This unexpected naval assault caught Angkor's defences completely off guard, and Cham forces successfully sacked the capital city of Yasodharapura, burning significant portions of the city and killing the reigning Khmer king, Tribhuvanadityavarman, in the ensuing chaos. The victorious Cham forces looted staggering quantities of accumulated treasure, including precious artwork, gold, and other valuable royal possessions, transporting this plunder back to their own territory as spoils of their successful raid. The kingdom subsequently endured approximately 4 years of genuine political chaos, existing without any single stable, universally recognized ruler capable of restoring order or organizing an effective response to the humiliation the empire had just suffered. The Cham invasion's success depended heavily on a specific tactical element that Khmer defences had evidently failed to adequately anticipate: the direct naval approach via the Tonle Sap Lake and its connecting waterways. This body of water, which dramatically expands during the monsoon season, provided a navigable route directly into the heart of Khmer territory that conventional land-based frontier defences were poorly positioned to intercept. Bas-relief carvings later commissioned at the Bayon Temple depicting this specific naval battle in remarkable narrative detail remain one of the most valuable visual historical records of pre-modern Southeast Asian naval warfare anywhere in the archaeological record, showing Cham and Khmer vessels engaged in close combat with a level of specificity that has allowed modern historians to reconstruct the tactical details of this pivotal engagement with unusual confidence. These carvings depict specific details including vessel construction, the types of weapons used by combatants, and even scenes of daily life among the common soldiers and their families that accompanied military campaigns, providing historians with visual evidence that complements and enriches the more sparse written textual record of this turbulent period. The specific artistic decision to commission such detailed depictions of a humiliating military defeat, rather than simply omitting this embarrassing episode from the official commemorative record, suggests that Jayavarman VII's later regime viewed the successful recovery from this crisis as a story worth telling in full, including its darkest chapter, precisely because the ultimate narrative of resurgence and eventual triumph over Champa made the initial catastrophe serve as a dramatically effective backdrop for celebrating the king's own subsequent achievements in restoring Khmer power and prestige. Jayavarman VII, already an older prince by the standards of the era, emerged from a period of relatively quiet retirement to personally organize and lead the military resistance that would ultimately expel Cham occupation forces from Khmer territory by 1181. Not content with simple defensive victory, he subsequently launched a sustained campaign of retaliation, eventually capturing Vijaya, the Cham capital itself, and formally incorporating Champa as a subordinate territory under direct Khmer control. In the aftermath of this crisis, Jayavarman VII made an extraordinary and historically significant religious decision, concluding that the traditional Hindu gods had evidently failed to adequately protect the capital during the Cham invasion. He converted the state religion to Mahayana Buddhism. This religious transformation carried profound ideological implications for the nature of Khmer kingship itself. The ruler was no longer simply a Devaraja, a manifestation of divine authority demanding worship, but was reconceived as a bodhisattva, a compassionate figure whose sacred duty was actively helping to save and protect his suffering subjects. Driven by evident urgency, Jayavarman VII initiated an extraordinarily ambitious public construction program, utilizing sandstone laterite for much of the new construction rather than the more traditional and more time-consuming stone blocks, specifically to allow his numerous building projects to be completed with unprecedented speed. The sheer scale of Jayavarman VII's building program, when measured against the length of his own reign, remains a genuine subject of scholarly astonishment among archaeologists studying Angkor. Within a period most historians estimate at roughly 3 to 4 decades, his administration oversaw the construction of Angkor Thom's massive defensive walls, the Bayon Temple with its hundreds of carved faces, the temples of Ta Prohm and Preah Khan, over 100 hospitals, more than 100 rest houses, and extensive road networks connecting these structures, an almost frantic pace of construction that some historians interpret as reflecting genuine religious conviction about the bodhisattva ideal of compassionate action, and others interpret more skeptically as a calculated political strategy to rapidly rebuild both the physical infrastructure and the psychological confidence that the Cham invasion had so badly damaged. To prevent any future disaster comparable to the devastating 1177 Cham invasion, the new capital city of Angkor Thom was surrounded by massive laterite defensive walls forming a square measuring 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers, further protected by an extensive and imposing moat. The city's monumental entrance gates were flanked by remarkable stone sculptures depicting gods and demons together engaged in a mythological tug-of-war contest, churning the cosmic ocean of milk in a scene drawn directly from Hindu-Buddhist mythology. At the very center of Angkor Thom stood the Bayon Temple, the empire's new spiritual heart, featuring 54 individual towers collectively displaying more than 200 serene carved faces, generally interpreted by scholars as representing either the Buddhist bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara or the king himself, gazing outward in all directions across every corner of his empire simultaneously. In one of the most remarkable and historically significant public health initiatives anywhere in the pre-modern world, Jayavarman VII commissioned the construction of 102 hospitals, called Arogyashala, distributed strategically throughout the empire, providing free medical treatment to ordinary subjects, and staffed by thousands of trained physicians and medical attendants. He additionally established 121 rest houses along the empire's major roads, providing shelter, food, and basic accommodation for travelers and merchants making their way across the vast territorial expanse of the empire. The hospital system Jayavarman VII established deserves particular attention as one of the more genuinely progressive public institutions anywhere in the pre-modern world. Inscriptions recovered from several hospital sites detail the specific staffing arrangements, including physicians, nurses, and support personnel numbering into the thousands across the full network, along with detailed lists of medicinal herbs and other treatments the state provided at no cost to patients. These inscriptions also specify the food rations allocated to hospital staff and patients alike, providing modern historians with an unusually detailed picture of pre-modern public health administration that has few parallels anywhere else in the medieval world, outside of certain Islamic hospital traditions operating in roughly the same historical period. The scale of this healthcare infrastructure, covering the entire breadth of the empire's territory, rather than being concentrated solely in the capital, suggests a genuinely ambitious vision of centralized state responsibility for public welfare that went considerably beyond what most contemporary monarchies anywhere in the world attempted to provide their subjects. The Bayon Temple's distinctive carved faces have generated sustained scholarly debate since their rediscovery, with researchers proposing various interpretations regarding their precise identity and symbolic meaning. While many scholars favor the interpretation that these serene, smiling faces represent the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, embodying compassion looking out across all directions to observe and respond to the suffering of all beings, others have argued the faces may represent a deliberate fusion of the Bodhisattva ideal with the physical likeness of Jayavarman VII himself, continuing the earlier Devaraja tradition of identifying the king's own image with divine authority, even within an ostensibly more humble, compassion-centered Buddhist religious framework. This interpretive ambiguity itself reflects something genuine about Jayavarman VII's broader religious and political project, a sophisticated attempt to retain the practical political benefits of associating royal authority with divine sanction, while simultaneously repositioning that authority within a religious framework that emphasized protective compassion rather than simple demand for worship and labor tribute. In 1296, the Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan arrived at Angkor as part of an official embassy and spent approximately 1 year residing in the city, subsequently producing the single most detailed and historically valuable first-hand written account of daily Khmer life to survive from this entire period. Zhou Daguan specifically noted with evident surprise that Khmer women held remarkably high economic authority within their society, observing that virtually all of the city's bustling commercial markets were run and directly managed by women rather than men. His account also describes the elaborate royal processions of King Indravarman III, featuring thousands of soldiers, women bearing ceremonial spears and shields, and ornate golden chariots and elephant-mounted platforms parading through the city's central avenues. He recorded that the city's residents bathed multiple times daily and used perfumed cosmetic preparations, observations that reflect a genuinely high standard of personal hygiene and urban sanitation practice for a civilization of this specific historical period. Zhou Daguan also documented the empire's distinctive trial-by-ordeal justice system, in which accused individuals suspected of a crime were required to sit for an extended period inside a specially constructed stone tower, the belief being that whoever fell ill first, according to prevailing religious conviction, was thereby divinely revealed to be the guilty party. Zhou Daguan's memoir, formerly titled The Customs of Cambodia, remains an extraordinarily rich historical source, precisely because it was written by an outside observer with no particular political motivation to flatter or condemn the society he was describing, unlike the surviving Khmer inscriptions themselves, which were almost exclusively commissioned by kings and religious institutions specifically to celebrate royal achievements and religious donations. His descriptions of ordinary domestic life, including housing construction, clothing customs distinguishing different social ranks, agricultural techniques, and even details about local fruits and wildlife, provide modern historians with a genuinely three-dimensional picture of daily Khmer existence that complements and often humanizes the more monumental, state-focused narrative that stone temple inscriptions alone would otherwise present. His account also notably describes the by then declining state of certain temple complexes even in 1296, offering historians valuable evidence about the specific timeline of the empire's gradual architectural and economic decline. Zhou Daguan's observations regarding Khmer marriage and family customs also provide valuable comparative context that complements the more state-focused historical record. He described specific courtship rituals, the relative informality of Khmer marriage ceremonies compared to the elaborate Confucian rituals of his own homeland, and the significant degree of personal autonomy Khmer women exercised in choosing marriage partners and managing household finances, details that align closely with his separate observations about women's dominant role in commercial market activity. His account also describes local agricultural calendars, fishing practices on the Tonle Sap Lake, which experiences a remarkable seasonal reversal of its water flow that dramatically expands the lake's surface area during monsoon season, and the specific varieties of fruit and vegetables cultivated in and around the capital, painting a comprehensive picture of a society whose economic and dietary life was intimately connected to the same water systems that sustained the empire's monumental architecture. The Khmer Empire constructed an extensive network of elevated royal roads, engineered specifically to remain above seasonal floodwaters, connecting the capital at Angkor to distant regional centres, including Phi Mai, in what is now Thailand, the Kingdom of Champa to the east, and various coastal ports. Massive laterite stone bridges, employing sophisticated corbel arch construction techniques, were built along these critical transportation routes, with several such bridges remaining structurally functional and in active local use even today, many centuries after their original construction. Long-distance trade networks connected the Khmer Empire commercially to China, exporting valuable commodities including animal hides, exotic bird feathers, and fragrant aromatic woods, in exchange for imported Chinese silk textiles, ceramics, and decorative parasols. Khmer military forces employed large mounted ballista weapons, positioned strategically on elephant-back platforms, capable of launching heavy projectiles with sufficient force to penetrate enemy shield defenses at considerable range during battlefield engagements. As the empire's total territorial extent continued growing throughout this period, Khmer military forces increasingly found themselves stretched dangerously thin, struggling to effectively suppress a growing pattern of recurring provincial rebellions occurring simultaneously across the empire's expanding and increasingly difficult-to-control frontier regions. The corbel arch bridges built during this period of infrastructure expansion represent a particularly clever engineering adaptation to local material constraints. Unlike the true arch technique that had been developed independently in various forms across the ancient Mediterranean world, corbel construction achieves a similar structural span by progressively overlapping flat stone slabs until they meet at the center, a technique that requires no keystone but demands extremely precise stone cutting and careful load calculation to prevent collapse. Several of these bridges, including the well-preserved Speen Praptos near modern Kampong Kedai, remain in active use by local traffic even today, a testament to the durability of laterite stone construction techniques that Khmer engineers refined across generations of practical building experience throughout the empire's road and canal network. Following Jayavarman VII's death, King Jayavarman V engineered a dramatic religious reversal, ordering the systematic destruction and defacement of tens of thousands of Buddhist statues and images throughout the empire in a deliberate effort to restore traditional Hindu worship as the dominant state religion. This whiplash pattern of repeated religious reversal, swinging the empire's official ideology back and forth between competing faiths, progressively eroded ordinary subjects' underlying confidence and trust in whatever religious and political framework happened to currently justify the ruling king's authority. Compounding this ideological instability, Theravada Buddhism began spreading steadily into Khmer territory from Sri Lanka during this same general period, carrying with it an explicitly egalitarian religious message that notably did not require or particularly emphasize the specific concept of divine or semi-divine kingship that had previously legitimized centralized royal authority. As this more egalitarian religious philosophy gained genuine popularity among the general population, ordinary subjects grew increasingly reluctant to continue providing the massive, unpaid public labor that royal authorities had long depended upon for constructing and maintaining the empire's temples and elaborate water infrastructure. The clearest and most telling sign of this accumulating institutional weakness was architectural. After the 13th century, the Khmer Empire essentially stopped constructing any significant new large-scale stone temples altogether, a highly visible signal of serious underlying economic decline and a corresponding loss of the centralized state capacity that had once made such monumental construction projects routinely possible. The specific religious dynamic at play here deserves careful examination, since it reveals a genuine ideological challenge that the traditional Khmer state had no ready answer for. Theravada Buddhism's core teaching that spiritual merit and enlightenment were achievable by any individual through personal conduct and meditation, without requiring the intermediary role of a divine king or elaborate state-sponsored temple ritual, directly undermined the theological foundation upon which centuries of Khmer royal authority had been constructed. When ordinary farmers began embracing a faith that explicitly did not require their labor or resources to be channeled toward constructing ever more elaborate monuments to royal divinity, the entire economic and political logic that had funded Angkor's construction for 4 centuries began losing its persuasive force at exactly the historical moment when the empire could least afford this particular crisis of legitimacy. The transition to Theravada Buddhism also had significant implications for literacy and religious education across Khmer society more broadly. Unlike the earlier Sanskrit-based Hindu and Mahayana Buddhist traditions, which required specialized Brahmin priests trained in a language and set of religious texts largely inaccessible to ordinary subjects, Theravada Buddhism, as practiced in Southeast Asia, typically involved vernacular teaching and encouraged more direct lay engagement with Buddhist texts and monastic institutions. This democratization of religious knowledge and practice, while representing a genuine positive development in terms of religious accessibility for ordinary Khmer subjects, simultaneously undermined the specific religious mystique and specialized priestly mediation that had previously reinforced the centralized authority of the God-King model, contributing to the gradual but unmistakable transformation of Khmer political culture away from the highly centralized, temple construction-focused model that had defined the empire during its Angkor period peak. Extensive deforestation across the Kulin mountain range, driven by the ongoing need to clear additional agricultural land and to obtain fuel for the lime-burning process required in construction, progressively stripped away the natural vegetation that had previously helped stabilize soil in the empire's critical upper watershed region. Without this forest cover to hold the soil in place, heavy seasonal monsoon rainfall began washing enormous quantities of loose sediment downstream, progressively filling in and clogging the elaborate network of canals and reservoirs that the entire hydraulic system depended upon to function correctly. Over multiple generations of continuous expansion, modification, and interconnection, Angkor's water management network had grown into an almost unmanageably complex system, one whose sheer scale and interconnected complexity made it increasingly difficult for royal administrators to properly monitor, maintain, and repair as problems inevitably began to emerge. Archaeological evidence recovered from the site clearly indicates that several of Angkor's major water control spillways experienced catastrophic structural failure at various points, apparently overwhelmed by sudden flood conditions, without ever subsequently being properly repaired or reconstructed by imperial authorities. Once this critical water management infrastructure began to fail, the city's underlying agricultural foundation collapsed in direct consequence. Dry season rice cultivation became impossible without reliable water storage, triggering serious and sustained food shortages for a resident population that, at its historical peak, may have numbered close to 1 million people. The Greater Angkor Project, an international archaeological research collaboration led by researchers including Roland Fletcher of the University of Sydney, working continuously since the late 1990s, has produced some of the most detailed physical evidence yet available regarding this specific hydraulic collapse. Ground surveys and sediment core analysis conducted by this research team identified clear physical evidence of massive flood damage at several key infrastructure points, including breached embankments at the West Baray and severe erosion damage at several critical spillway junctions, dating specifically to the same general period that other historical evidence identifies as the beginning of Angkor's broader decline. This research has fundamentally shifted scholarly understanding of Angkor's collapse away from a purely military or purely religious explanation toward a more integrated environmental history that recognizes infrastructure failure as a central and, in some respects, primary causal factor. Sediment core analysis conducted at the West Baray and several smaller reservoirs has also revealed evidence of significant siltation occurring well before the final collapse, indicating that the deforestation-driven sediment problem had been accumulating gradually for generations rather than emerging suddenly in the final decades of the empire's existence. This slow accumulation pattern helps explain why contemporary Khmer administrators may not have fully recognized the severity of the underlying structural problem until relatively late, since gradual siltation of the kind evidenced in the sediment record would have reduced reservoir capacity incrementally over multiple generations, making the cumulative effect difficult to perceive without the kind of longitudinal environmental monitoring that no pre-modern administration anywhere in the world possessed the scientific tools to conduct systematically. Modern scientific analysis of tree ring growth patterns from ancient trees across mainland Southeast Asia has revealed dramatic climate fluctuations occurring specifically during the 14th century, providing crucial physical evidence corroborating the historical timeline of Angkor's decline. This scientific dendrochronological data documents a series of prolonged, multi-decade droughts, during which the critical seasonal monsoon rains that Angkor's entire agricultural system depended upon simply failed to arrive with their normal reliability year after year, causing the vital reservoirs to run dangerously and progressively dry. Following these extended dry periods, The same tree ring evidence indicates the subsequent arrival of extraordinarily intense monsoon flooding, unleashing sudden and catastrophic water surges that overwhelmed and destroyed the aging, poorly maintained canal infrastructure that drought conditions had already left critically weakened and vulnerable. Modern climate scientists studying this specific period have identified the likely influence of El Niño weather pattern cycles, a naturally occurring global climate phenomenon that functioned, in this particular historical instance, as an invisible and unavoidable natural force actively working against the empire's continued agricultural survival. Faced with this compounding combination of severe water shortage and periodic catastrophic flooding, tens of thousands of residents began gradually abandoning the increasingly unlivable capital, migrating steadily toward more reliable and secure agricultural areas situated closer to the Mekong River and other dependable water sources elsewhere in the region. The dendrochronological research underlying this climate reconstruction, conducted primarily by teams working with the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University, examined growth ring patterns preserved in ancient Phokinia hodginsii cypress trees found in the mountains of central Vietnam, some specimens of which have growth records extending back many centuries and providing an annual, highly precise record of regional rainfall variation. This tree ring data revealed a severe drought period, lasting from approximately 1362 to 1392, followed by another significant dry period in the early 15th century, with brief but intense wet periods interspersed between them, precisely the kind of volatile climate whiplash pattern that would have placed maximum stress on an already aging and poorly maintained water infrastructure system, first drying out the reservoirs to dangerously low levels and then overwhelming weakened embankments and spillways with sudden flood surges once the rains eventually returned. This specific climate research, published in a landmark 2010 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by a team including Brendan Buckley and other dendrochronology specialists, represented one of the first instances in which precise, annually resolved paleoclimate data was successfully integrated with the existing archaeological and historical record for Angkor, effectively creating an interdisciplinary case study that other researchers studying pre-modern societal collapse elsewhere in the world have subsequently used as a methodological model. The specific value of tree ring data in this context lies in its remarkable precision. Unlike many other paleoclimate proxies that provide only rough estimates spanning decades or centuries, properly cross-dated tree ring sequences can identify individual drought or flood years with a level of chronological accuracy that allows researchers to correlate specific climate events directly against the documented dates of temple construction pauses, population movements, and military campaigns recorded in surviving Khmer and neighboring kingdoms' historical sources. Several formerly subordinate Thai vassal states in the western regions of the empire, including Sukhothai and subsequently the increasingly powerful kingdom of Ayutthaya, took advantage of Angkor's accumulating internal weaknesses to declare their own full independence and rapidly build significant, capable military forces of their own. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, Ayutthaya launched repeated military campaigns directly against the weakened Khmer capital, exploiting the empire's severely diminished capacity for effective self-defense following decades of compounding economic and environmental crisis. With its population already substantially reduced by ongoing famine conditions and by the steady, continuous migration of residents seeking more reliable and secure livelihoods elsewhere, Angkor could no longer reliably field the massive citizen armies that had once effectively defended the empire's frontiers against comparable external threats. In 1431, Ayutthayan forces under the command of King Boromiracha II successfully besieged and ultimately captured the great city of Angkor Thom itself, marking the final, definitive military conquest of the once great Khmer capital. Beyond simply seizing accumulated gold and other physical treasure, Ayutthayan forces deliberately captured and forcibly relocated substantial numbers of Khmer scholars, skilled artisans, trained court dancers, and Brahmin religious priests back to their own capital, inflicting a devastating and lasting loss of specialized human capital and accumulated cultural knowledge upon the defeated Khmer state. This specific pattern of cultural appropriation through forced relocation of skilled personnel had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military and economic damage of the 1431 conquest itself. The Khmer court dancers, musicians, and Brahmin ritual specialists brought to Ayutthaya profoundly influenced the subsequent development of Thai classical court culture, including dance forms, royal ceremonial practice, and administrative terminology that Thai institutions absorbed directly from Khmer sources and which remain recognizably present in Thai royal and cultural traditions even today. Some historians argue that this cultural transmission, ironic as it may seem given the violent circumstances of the conquest itself, effectively preserved elements of sophisticated Khmer court culture that might otherwise have been lost entirely during the chaos and economic collapse that followed Angkor's fall, embedding Khmer civilizational achievements within the cultural fabric of the very kingdom that had militarily defeated it. The repeated nature of Ayutthayan military pressure against Angkor throughout the 14th and early 15th centuries also deserves emphasis, since it demonstrates that the 1431 conquest was the culmination of a sustained strategic campaign rather than a single unexpected catastrophe. Thai chronicles and Khmer inscriptions together document at least several major military campaigns against the Khmer capital in the decades preceding its final fall, indicating that Angkor's defenders had genuine, repeated warning of the growing threat from the west, yet proved unable to permanently resolve the underlying combination of environmental and economic weakness that made each successive Ayutthayan campaign more difficult to repel than the last. This pattern of repeated, escalating military pressure against a progressively weakening capital bears a notable structural resemblance to the pattern of decline visible in several other pre-modern empires, whose stories similarly combine external military pressure with internal environmental and administrative crisis, feeding into and compounding one another over an extended period. Following the devastating 1431 conquest, King Ponhea Yat made the difficult and momentous decision to formally relocate the Khmer capital away from Angkor entirely, concluding that the city had become simultaneously too vulnerable to renewed external military attack and too severely damaged by its own compromised water infrastructure to remain a viable seat of continued royal power. The royal capital subsequently moved progressively southeastward across several successive locations, first to Tuol Basan, then later to Chaktomuk, the site of the modern city of Phnom Penh, and eventually to Longvek, locations that offered considerably more favorable access to increasingly important riverine and maritime commercial trade routes. Angkor itself, however, was never entirely and completely abandoned in the way popular legend has often suggested. A resident population, along with a continuous succession of Buddhist monks, remained present at the site and continued actively maintaining and using Angkor Wat itself as a functioning religious site across the following centuries, even as the surrounding city gradually declined. This continuity of religious use deserves particular emphasis, since it directly contradicts the popular romantic image of Angkor as a completely forgotten lost city rediscovered by chance after centuries of total isolation. Inscriptions and structural modifications dating to the 16th and 17th centuries demonstrate ongoing royal patronage of Angkor Wat, even after the capital itself had relocated elsewhere, including one notable inscription recording a royal visit and religious donation from a Khmer king in the 1570s, well over a century after the traditional date given for the empire's supposed final collapse. Buddhist monks maintained a continuous presence at the temple complex throughout this entire period, conducting religious ceremonies and basic maintenance that helped preserve the site's structural integrity, even as the surrounding urban infrastructure that had once supported 1 million residents gradually succumbed to the encroaching forest. Over subsequent generations, dense tropical forest vegetation gradually overtook and enveloped the once bustling urban infrastructure surrounding the temple complexes, transforming what had recently been the largest city in the world into what increasingly appeared to distant observers as a mysterious, half-hidden ruin swallowed by encroaching jungle growth. Although various Portuguese and Spanish explorers had documented brief encounters with Angkor as early as the 16th century, it was the French naturalist Henri Mouhot's widely read and richly illustrated 1860 published account that first brought the site to genuine sustained global attention and recognition. Recent airborne LiDAR laser scanning technology has revolutionized modern scholarly understanding of the site's true historical extent, revealing that Greater Angkor's full urban footprint once sprawled across many hundreds of square kilometers, an urban settlement considerably larger and more sophisticated than researchers had previously understood or even suspected using conventional ground-based archaeological survey methods alone. The story of Angkor's decline stands today as one of history's most instructive case studies in environmental overreach, a powerful demonstration of how even history's most sophisticated engineering achievements can ultimately become catastrophically vulnerable when the delicate underlying ecological systems supporting them are pushed irreversibly beyond their natural sustainable limits. Yet despite the water system's ultimate failure and the eventual decline of the surrounding city, the remarkably enduring stone foundations of Angkor Wat itself continue standing firm today, having withstood the passage of more than 8 centuries with a structural resilience that modern engineers still study and genuinely admire. Angkor has since become the defining and universally recognized national symbol of Cambodia, prominently featured on the country's official flag across every successive political era, representing a source of profound and enduring national pride that remains genuinely unmatched by any other single historical or cultural achievement in the nation's long history. In the final and most accurate historical assessment, the Khmer Empire never truly disappeared or was ever entirely destroyed. It fundamentally transformed itself, evolving from an inland agricultural state built entirely around sophisticated water management into a more mobile riverine trading civilization, a continuous cultural and political lineage that persists and continues actively evolving in the nation of Cambodia to this very day. The rediscovery and ongoing scholarly reinterpretation of Angkor over the past century and a half offers its own remarkable historical narrative, one that reveals as much about changing Western attitudes towards Southeast Asian civilization as it does about the site itself. Henri Mouhot, whose 1860 illustrated journal brought Angkor to wide European attention, famously and rather condescendingly compared the temple complex favorably to the works of Michelangelo, expressing genuine astonishment that what he considered a relatively unsophisticated regional population could have produced monuments of this scale and quality. This dismissive colonial-era framing, which persistently suggested that contemporary Khmer people could not possibly be the direct cultural descendants of Angkor's builders, took decades of subsequent archaeological and epigraphic research to fully dismantle, as scholars gradually established beyond reasonable dispute the direct historical and cultural continuity between the Angkorian civilization and the Cambodian people who continued living in and around the site throughout the intervening centuries. French colonial administration, which controlled Cambodia from the 1860s until the mid-20th century, conducted extensive restoration and archaeological work at Angkor, work that was scientifically valuable but also politically complicated, since French colonial authorities frequently used the grandeur of Angkor's ruins to justify their own civilizing mission narrative, implying that contemporary Cambodians required European guidance and administration to reclaim the glory of their own ancestors. The École Française d'Extrême-Orient, established in 1900, conducted the systematic epigraphic and architectural surveys that first established the detailed chronology of Khmer kings and construction phases that modern historians still rely upon today, even as the broader colonial political context within which this research occurred remains a subject of ongoing critical historical reassessment. The Khmer Rouge period in the 1970s inflicted its own particular damage on Angkor and on the broader scholarly infrastructure surrounding it, with the site suffering from landmines, looting, and the general chaos of civil war, while an entire generation of Cambodian archaeologists, historians, and site conservators were killed or displaced during the broader genocide that devastated Cambodian intellectual and professional classes during this period. The subsequent decades of careful restoration work, conducted through international collaboration including UNESCO-coordinated projects involving teams from India, Japan, France, Germany, China, and other nations, represent both a technical archaeological achievement and a broader act of cultural and national healing for a country whose modern history has been shaped so profoundly by both the grandeur of its ancient past and the trauma of its more recent history. Recent LiDAR aerial surveys, conducted using laser scanning technology mounted on helicopters flying systematic grid patterns over the dense forest canopy surrounding the known temple complexes, have revealed archaeological features invisible to any previous generation of ground-based researchers. These surveys identified extensive urban grid patterns, previously unknown temple mounds, and agricultural field boundaries extending far beyond what scholars had previously mapped, confirming that Greater Angkor's true urban extent was considerably larger and more densely settled than even the most optimistic prior estimates had suggested. This technology has effectively rewritten the scale of what researchers understand Angkor to have actually been, transforming it from an impressive collection of monumental temples into what is now recognized as one of the largest pre-industrial urban settlements documented anywhere on Earth. The question that Angkor's rise and fall poses most directly to the modern world concerns the relationship between engineering ambition and ecological limits, a question that feels considerably more urgent to contemporary audiences than it might have to previous generations of historians studying this same material. An empire that mastered water management on a scale unmatched anywhere else in the pre-modern world ultimately found itself undone, at least in significant part, by the environmental consequences of its own success. Deforestation that its expanding agricultural and construction needs required, a water system whose complexity eventually exceeded the administrative capacity to properly maintain it, and a climate whose natural variability, when combined with a weakened and poorly maintained infrastructure, proved more than the system could absorb. The stones of Angkor Wat still stand, having outlasted the political and religious systems that built them by many centuries. What ultimately failed was not the stone but the water, the very element that had made Angkor's greatness possible in the first place, and whose careful management the empire had once perfected before, slowly, gradually, losing its grip on the delicate balance that sustained an entire civilization.